This is Sound and Vision from KEXP. I'm Emily Fox. Jeremy Dutcher is a Polaris Prize and Juno Award-winning Wolastoqiyik artist from Eastern Canada.
KEXP dewen intlewe spekudu blog and dogaduje o negutkuk wabanaki kuk naga nujin tak naga widu jochage na naga bele nidabig.
Dutcher is passionate about learning his people's native language of Wolastoqiyik. That's the language Dutcher's mother grew up speaking. In fact, Dutcher and his mom recently opened up a language immersion school for 4-year-olds in an effort to help bring the language back to the community. It's been estimated that there are only about 100 speakers left. Dutcher is also a classically trained singer. Their previous award-winning album was sung entirely in Wolastoqiyik. That album featured Dutcher's classical voice singing in combination with wax cylinder recordings from the early 1900s of the Wolastoqiyik singing their traditional songs and melodies. Dutcher released their second album on October 6th. It's sung both in English and in Wolastoqiyik. It explores the Indigenous two-spirit identity, of which Dutcher identifies with, and it also covers issues present in Indigenous communities and looks forward towards healing.
The title of the album is called Motewolonuwok. And Motewolonuwok, I mean, when you look it up in our dictionary, it says witches. But it's such a flattened misunderstanding of everything that word means. The best translation I ever heard about this word was the people of great spiritual power. But I like to go at it from a linguistic perspective. Motewolin, Modew is those first 5 letters of that word, is something that can be heard but not seen. So it's like, and we use it quite often to talk about that which is kind of unknowable or mysterious. And then so a Motewolin is like a practitioner of that which can be heard but not seen. And Motewolonuwok is just the plural form of that, right? So it is talking about the magic beings, and often this term gets applied to musicians. And sometimes it even gets applied to queer people, like two-spirit people who are LGBT and also Indigenous. So for me, it's a very magic word. And there's a reason, I think, that the church kind of demonized it a little bit, because, and so in naming it that, it's about kind of reclaiming that and saying, actually, no, there's a lot of power in that which we don't understand.
Going back to, pre-colonization, weren't two-spirit people, weren't they in high regard in their community? Like they were seen as powerful?
That's the thing. That's the whole flip, right? Which is a whole 180 from the kind of Judeo-Christian sense of sin and coming out and all this stuff. It's well, that's one way of thinking about it and reacting to queer people. But there was another way, and there's so many teachings. And now that I've gone around and I've met so many people at that intersection, and even put them, my last video for Take My Hand, it had it featured one of our two-spirit elders telling her story in the language. So it's the more that I meet people, it's just so affirming that it's nothing new, within our communities, this celebration of queer brilliance and of queer magic is the most traditional thing. And so it's about kind of remembering that and trying to, in those pre-colonial days, our communities were small and self-sufficient. And there was no room to ostracize or to push out anyone's gift. So I think it's about honoring ourselves and speaking truth to that space of we got a special thing going on. And at one time, there was that celebration around it. And at one time soon there will be again. But we're in a hard place right now where a lot of our young people feel like there's no hope, the suicide rates I mean, I really only know the stats here in Canada, but I'm sure they're quite similar in the States. But the suicide rates for young queer people and the suicide rates for young Indigenous people are sky high.
I think it's like 3 times the national average, isn't it?
Yeah, and then you start to think about that intersection, and it's just, yeah. So for me, it's about creating imagery and telling stories from that space that aren't necessarily about re-traumatizing us. They are about healing us, but also about kind of speaking to the dominant and saying like, hey, stop. Like stop and look at this. And there's our languages didn't get up and walk away. They came off the end of a strap and, through the harsh words of a nun. That we have a lot of healing to do. And I think language particularly is a really good site for that healing. So, as much as I wanted to communicate all of these stories and this poetry to English people and, non-Indigenous people, to have, half of it still in the language for me was kind of important as well. Just to keep it oriented and keep kind of one foot in the ground of where it comes from.
When you feel all this grief, when your tears find you again, when your heart asks who's there, dreams still whispering, until we start to sing again.
So you're also a classically trained vocalist. I think your voice is amazing. And, I can hear that classical influence on this record, but there's also a song on here that you say is sung in sky language. Tell me more about what sky language is, but also just generally, what were the musical traditions of your people?
So Sago is the 6th track on this record. And this one is actually one of the only ones that's still connected to the melodies from the first research process. And with a lot of those old songs, when I would take them to, because that was part of the process. It was like going and listening to them in the museum, but also taking them out and playing them for elders and people that might know them, that might recognize them. And 2, for me as a language learner at the time, it was about, I sometimes felt maybe inequipped to sit with that and fully understand exactly what was being said. I could pull out words and kind of get a gist of it, but for some of them, I really had no idea. So I would take them to, speakers and elders and people, knowledge keepers in the community, and I would play it. And so usually they would, know exactly what's being said because it's pretty clear if you listen close. But some of them, actually, with this track, I just remember she said, "Oh no, I don't know what's being said. That's old language. That's sky language." And I said, "So what do you mean? That's like," I kind of had some questions about that too. And she's like, "Yeah, that's the ancestors. That's the language they speak, but we don't know that anymore." And so this cool, like this evolution of linguistics in our community has worked because our written language is only 30 years old. The language has changed really rapidly because languages that are written down, they change at a super quick rate. Like almost every generation is like change, like big time. So basically that the talk is saying sky language was acknowledging that like the language has changed so much since this song was first sung that we don't actually really know what it is saying from a like linguistic or translational level. But it's still sacred because it's from the ancestors. So we still sing it, even though we don't necessarily have a literal understanding of what's being said. And that can be that kind of mystery is really powerful, I think. And yeah, I think when you go and this is something that's been known about Native music for a long time. You think about the anthropologists, and they even talked about this too. They didn't say sky language. They said nonsense syllables. Which that just goes to show you the kind of like the two perspectives kind of looking at each other and not really understanding. But that's why we create from our perspectives so that we can garner understanding from others and hopefully get to know each other a little better.
From your understanding, like, what were the musical traditions of the Wolastoqiyik?
Up until 1951 in Canada, gathering and sharing our songs was kind of not okay, like kind of illegal, right? Like you could be imprisoned. And so contextualizing in that to say like, oh, when I was a kid, we didn't really have Indian songs around. And it's like, well, yeah, no kidding. You know? But then connected to the American Indian movement in the 60s and 70s, it's like we see this like massive emergence of people sharing traditional songs again. And so, you know, but they say nothing ever died. You know, it never went out. We just didn't do it in public anymore. There was this like sharing of this like underground song network, which kind of kept our songs going. And so in the 60s and 70s, it started to come out again, and it's not going away.
So the last 3 songs in this record were inspired by poems by a Cherokee poet. Tell me about the poems and the messages you're sharing on these tracks.
Ooh, yes. So there's a Two-Spirit poet named Quolie Driscoll, and they wrote this like kind of eulogy, I guess, to a young Two-Spirit person that was murdered, I think in the 90s. So it's kind of contrasts with the story of Matthew Shepard, who I'm sure you're familiar with, who was like a young white boy that was murdered in Nevada or Montana or Wyoming. Oh. And of course, both are tragic, but one got a lot of news play, and the other one we don't know about. So this eulogy, I think, was a way to memorialize that and to also talk about our collective responsibility to each other, to protect one another. And like as communities that are coming from different perspectives, it always needs to be a respectful dialogue. And so for me, those poems they held a lot. They held the grief and also the joy and the beauty of resilience, all kind of up against each other. And that was very much a part of my thinking around this record was, you know, speaking from that intersection and talking about grief and joy like this.
Yeah. Yeah, because there is kind of this song of like hope and resilience towards the end of the album. But before we get there, I mean, there's some really powerful and hard tracks to listen to when you look at the lyrics. Yeah. You know, one of them is "Ancestors Too Young."
You can leave the flowers by the bed. Leave the light on. No one cared until she was dead.
Can you talk about that track?
They were hard to sing too, I'll be honest with you. Like there was a couple of times I had to duck out from the studio time and have a little smoke in the alleyway and a little cry. You know, that song in particular is really looking at, and it's funny because that Ancestors Too Young has a whole different context now. After all of these kind of residential school discoveries, these burial grounds have been discovered at schools in Canada. So now that song has a whole new context, but actually it's about, like many years ago, I went and visited a northern community in Ontario and meeting a mother who had lost their child to suicide and just unspeakable grief, meeting that, you know, and so understanding that sometimes those experiences bring a lot more questions, you know, certainly than answers, and trying to tell a story of strength through that grief, and that your community is going to be around you to lift you up when you need it the most. That one was a hard one to tell and to write. And I remember there's a trumpet solo at the end of that song where I remember I just asked the trumpeter, because I had this experience of being in this, you know, sharing circle and you know, this mother just sharing, and it's complete silence, but all you hear is a wail, the grief, you know, and there's everything in that voice, the low and the high and the broken and the strong. And so I just asked that trumpeter to play grief. That was my only instruction, play grief. And you can hear it on there. Like, it's really strong what she comes out with.
And then the following track is also super chilling. Tell me about the story you're telling in The Land That Held Them.
Oh, gosh. Give us a break, Jeremy. Jeez, it's too much. I mean, that one really comes from, I was really inspired by the singer, well, always have been, by the singer Nina Simone. And she has this song called Mississippi Goddamn. And it's such an indictment of the like racist system at the time that you know, saw these young girls murdered, and it was telling really hard stories, but kind of in a way that tapped your toe, in a way that moved your heart. And you know, I just, over these past couple of years, I look at this story, the headlines in Canada, and it's like, where's our Winnipeg goddamn? Where's our Saskatchewan, goddamn? You know, like there's so many stories like that exist in this place. And sometimes the headline can dehumanize or like take it, kind of boil it down to details, when these aren't headlines. These are people. These are somebody's kids, you know? So each verse is kind of looking at a different story, kind of from the last couple years in Canadian Indigenous news, and trying to breathe some kind of humanity into that space, and just say, this was a girl. She was 14. Search the river until you find her. You know, this was a boy. He was a young kid. He was shot point blank by a farmer who didn't want him on his property. Like, arrest him. Like, why did he run free? And then with the delivery of that song, it wasn't necessary. With Ancestors, it's about kind of shouting it out. With this one, it's almost like I wanted to deliver that song like reading the newspaper. You know, it's very soft, and it doesn't move. It's like a placid lake, because that's what it feels like sometimes when you read these stories in the news, and there's such casual disregard for Indigenous life. And these stories get boiled down into points, bullet points, and, oh, what was in her system? Or, you know, all of these kind of dirty questions come in. And for me, it's just, it has to be more than that, because we need to do better about honoring the ones we lose.
Into the field he went, propelled by the air he left. Oh, that shot from so close by. 10 long minutes before he called, and the all-white jury said,
The headlines you're referencing, are they just Native lives that have been lost that like weren't investigated, or is it also just the residential school stories? Is it both of those things?
Yeah, it's kind of all there, right? You know, it's like I tried to tell a really expansive story with that song, and I hope it's not too much. And I really don't, you know, my intention is to not re-traumatize or to pull out, you know, sore places of grief that don't need to be exhumed. But also, for me, there's also potential healing there if we actually look at it. And for me, because we're having that conversation as a nation, and probably we should be as a continent, about these histories of these schools and boarding schools and everything that went on in those spaces, at the very least, at least we're sharing that story, sharing that burden of that history now. Because we've known, I mean, in our communities, we tell the stories about this. We knew that these schools had graveyards and that a lot of kids didn't make it home. And yeah, I think if our non-Indigenous brothers and sisters, if our newcomers, if all those people start to know that too, maybe then at least they can contextualize, them seeing a hard-off Native person living in the street. Maybe then it kind of makes sense because they didn't really have a chance. And so then we can extend some healing and extend some empathy, for God's sakes. It's like we need that kind of message right now. And I think I'm very honored and happy to be a bearer of that and to try to use music for something, because I think, music isn't what we think it is. It's not entertainment, and it's not something to be sold or like a commodity. It's about a healing energy. And those sonic vibrations of going to a live show or even just putting a record on and hearing somebody soar, it feels good. It feels good to us. And it gives us, hopefully, confidence to sing our own song or tell our own story or bring it forward, whatever we know needs to be brought forward.
So your song, Together We Emerge, was really powerful with a message of moving forward through collective healing. Tell me more about that song and its meaning to you.
Well, that one's kind of like the apex of the whole thing, It's kind of everything is leading up to that moment. And when the choir is really present there and just like is full, I think they're saying, "You will be our song." It's the first time we hear that choir in English. So it's really kind of the community is popping through, and it's like I was saying, an invitation kind of to sing along for people and to join that call to the sacredness of our women and our trans women, especially, that hold a precarious place in our society. Increasingly so. We have a lot of regressive policies and a lot of bad laws that I think are taking us backwards. So I think to remind us that if we sing together and if we love each other enough, we can actually come through, and emerge into a better space and place.
That was my conversation with Jeremy Dutcher. Their album Motewolonuwok was released on October 6th. And if you want to hear more from Jeremy Dutcher, we'll post a link to our 2021 conversation about their previous album in the podcast description. And you can check out the latest Live on KEXP podcast. It features Jeremy Dutcher's recent in-studio session here at KEXP. Coming up next time on Sound and Vision, we'll hear from the frontman of Dead Pioneers as he breaks down his band's songs We Were Punk First and Bad Indians.
A woman once asked me my Indian name, and I said, "It's Greg." And she was so disappointed. She was like, "No, it has to be Red Eagle or Two Rivers or Gray Skull." I said, "Yes, wait, is that for real?" No, I said.
So Bad Indian really is just sort of the embodiment of like how I'm a bad Native person because I am not falling into these tropes or these stereotypes that are expected of me.
That's next time on the Sound and Vision podcast. Be sure to subscribe to the show, rate it, and review it in your podcast app. KEXP's fundraising drive is coming up next week, and I would so appreciate if you help support this show financially. You can do that at kexp.org/sound. We'll toss that link in the show description as well. Thanks for listening.